So this horse walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Hey, why the long face?" uh, Excuse me. My name's Kirk. I'm going to be talking to you about the Torah, which may be one of the most potentially boring subjects in the entire world. So every once in a while I'll just throw in a stupid joke to make the boring lessons that you're about to hear even more lame. Not only that, but I'm going to do it in the most amateur way possible so that you can at least have some fun laughing at how bad I am on video. Anyway, I've been wanting to teach this for a while. I've taught it at church and other places, and this is an opportunity for me to hopefully teach something to young people that is really important. It'll really make a difference in your life, or it can, and if not your life, it can make it possible for you to make a difference in the lives of other people. So I'm hopeful that you'll take the lessons that we're going to learn here and be able to apply them. The Torah doesn't have to be something that's just some weird bunch of old stuff from the Old Testament, and it doesn't have to be a bunch of children's stories. It actually has a practical application in your everyday life. You may be studying calculus or geometry or algebra or something in school and think to yourself, boy, I have no use for this whatsoever. This will not be true of the Torah. You have a use for this. Every single situation in life produces it. Here, I want you to imagine a situation with me for a second. Pretend, just for a second, that you or someone you know, actually you probably don't have to pretend, it's probably true of a whole bunch of you, are stuck in some weird situation. Let's say, for instance, that your girlfriend or your boyfriend just left you, and it doesn't seem like life is worth living, and you can't get him back or her back. Let's say that your parents have you grounded, or your parents are not nice and they're unkind, and there's nothing you can do. You can't be good enough, and you can't be right enough, and you can never make good enough grades to get out of trouble with them, and they don't really trust you or believe you. Or let's say that you're stuck in a situation where you're addicted to something, drugs or alcohol or whatever it is. There are lots of kinds of situations in our life where we feel stuck. I remember a friend of mine, when he was a little kid, his big brother used to pin him down, and he would sit with both of his knees on his little brother's shoulders while his little brother was laying flat on his back, and he'd be on top of him, lean over him, and then he would let spit come out of his mouth and like let it drip down, and then suck it back in right before it would let loose. Just torture the poor kid. But he was stuck, and there's no way to get up. There's no way out of it. There's nothing you can do. You're stuck in a situation at home. You're stuck in a situation at school or in a relationship, whatever it is. I want you to think in those terms, because that is the situation that we're going to start with in our story about the Torah. Okay, I've used this word Torah a few times. Let me just tell you what the word Torah is about. The word Torah, it just is the Hebrew word for law. That's all it is, law. So in the New Testament, when it talks about experts in the law, for instance, it's not talking about lawyers the way you and I would think of them. They're sort of more like Bible scholars, except that the law was not just a religious code. It was also a code of law for a country, a nation. The word Torah sometimes is used to refer to the whole Old Testament. When Jews talk about reading the Torah or the Talmud, when they use the Torah that way, they're talking about the whole Old Testament. Sometimes, strictly speaking, if you wanted to be technical, it's the 613 commandments that are found in the first 5 books of the Bible. I don't know who sat around and counted that up, and I don't really care, and I doubt you do either, but there are 613 of them, everybody says, so whatever. Okay, but now here's the thing. Generally speaking, what most people mean when they talk about the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, the books written by Moses. Jesus will say things about it's written in the law of Moses, or didn't Moses write this, or whatever. And those kinds of expressions, he's referring to the Torah, and that's what we're going to talk about in here for the next few weeks. I want you to understand something, though. The Torah may mean law technically, and it may have to do with the Old Testament or the 613 laws, or in our case, these 5 books, which is probably the best way to use the word to refer to those first 5 books. Some people teach you to call it the Pentateuch. I don't know why, because there's no reason to really learn that. But Torah, just think of the Torah as the first 5 books. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, if you've ever tried to read the Bible through, you know that when you get to Leviticus, you're wishing that you didn't decide to read the Bible through. Numbers, very boring. Little parts of it are pretty good, but most of it's really boring. But here's the thing. If you learn the stories that are in there, what you'll find out is that there is value to this that goes way beyond just those technical laws and counting people and a bunch of weird names. There's some good stuff in there. And really, this is the story of a group of people that are stuck. They're stuck in a situation they cannot get out of, no matter how hard they work, no matter how good they are, no matter how bad they are, no matter how much they complain or there's nothing they can do. They're completely stuck. They can't fight somebody and get out of it. They just can't get out of it, no matter what. The Torah is a series of stories that reveals to us God introducing himself to this group of people that are stuck in a situation and offering to help them out of a situation they can't get out of any other way than by God, by his power. And if you guys know of anybody, or if you're stuck in a situation like this, you're going to want to learn these stories, because what you're going to learn is that you can get out of whatever you're in by the power of God. You can learn to endure it and even be happy while you're stuck in the situation. But God will get you out of it eventually. So I'm going to take a break now and let you have some discussion questions that I've provided your teacher, and then we'll get back to studying the text. And I'll leave you with this picture, this on the screen it's from the 119th Psalm. David, King David, the guy that killed Goliath and stuff, when he was a young man, he loved the Torah. And when he says, "Oh, how I love your law, it is my meditation all the day," that's the Torah. That word law is the word Torah. And so that's what he loved. He loved this. And it's what made him a great man, that love. So I'll leave you with that passage, and then you go do these questions right now, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. I'd like for you, we're going to get started with the story now, and I want you to think of this story as you would a movie. All right, we're going to pretend that you're actually watching a movie about this, and the problem, what I want you to do is to learn how to see it from different perspectives so that you can feel what the people in the story are feeling. Now, generally speaking, most people will refer to this movie as the Exodus, and they call it that because of the second book of the Bible is called Exodus. Exodus is a Greek word. It means the way out. And so the stories we're going to tell mostly come from this book called the Exodus. And remember, it's written by Moses. And that's why I call it the Torah, because what we're really doing is studying the first 5 books of the Bible. We're really studying Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what we're actually doing. But in order to understand any book of the Bible, you have to know the context. And the context is the setting in which it takes place. You need to know kind of the story behind it. Otherwise, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and people start making common mistakes. You may have seen, people who are confused about the Old Testament. They're not sure, should we obey the laws or not obey the laws? There's a controversy these days about whether the 10 Commandments should appear in courthouses and so forth. And it's mostly just well-meaning people who haven't learned to understand the Torah in its context. So that's what we're going to do. Now, there's one more note about our little movie here, and it's about perspective. There are 3 characters in this movie: God, Moses, and the people. God is the star of our little movie. But the people and Moses are the ones that we're going to be able to relate to a little bit and to kind of understand how God works. But in order to do that, you have to see it from their perspective, from their point of view. All right? And seeing things from a certain point of view changes the way that you see the scene. Let me give you an example. Here's a group of people who are having lunch after church on a Sunday together. Families having a good lunch, everything's fine, they're happy, they're eating, everything's good, right? Now, what they don't see is what's under the table. And if we change our perspective a little bit, then we'll start seeing that what's under the table, and the kids are running away from it, is a giant spider that's on one of the guy's shoes. This spider is about to crawl up his pant leg. Well, you can imagine what happens next. You see, perspective changes everything. Our point of view changes the way that we see things. And what I want you to do, I can't do this for you. You're going to have to help me out. I want you to start seeing this story, the stories I'm going to tell over the next couple of weeks. I want you to see these stories from the perspective of the person involved or the people involved, okay? So, we're going to start out by studying the people, and first, I want you to bear this in mind. This is a passage from the book of 1 Corinthians in the New Testament. And this is what Paul wrote. He said, "These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come." Now, bear this in mind, you see. These things happen to them, and we'll get into the stories and get into their situation. But the reality is, and God knew this the whole time, they, of course, didn't have any idea. This is the spider under the table. They're living their lives, and they're very involved in their own little world, just as we are. But what we don't realize, and what they didn't realize, was that the events taking place in their life, in their world, were examples for us, and that God caused those things to happen and those things to take place for us to learn from. Okay? So now here we go. First character is the chosen people. Chosen because God chose Abraham. Abraham believed in God, but Abraham didn't know God's name. Abraham just knew that there was a God. He was invisible, and he spoke to him. Abraham had lots of gods, by the way. All of these people did. The chosen people had many gods, and they didn't know this one invisible God that was the God of their ancestor, Abraham. Now, we know the story because we think in terms of them being slaves in Egypt, and they were. But it wasn't always that way. You see, when Abraham had a son named Isaac, Isaac had a son named Jacob, Jacob had 12 sons and kids and grandkids and all of that, okay? Now, when those people first went into Egypt, you might remember the story of Joseph if you know these stories. Joseph became a big guy in Egypt. Well, now our story begins hundreds of years later. And everybody, particularly the new Pharaoh, has forgotten anybody named Joseph or how these people got there. When these people went into Egypt, they were just a big family. There was only 70 something of them, 12 kids and grandkids and all family and everything, 70 people. Now, 300 and something years later, there are over 1 million of these people living in Egypt. Over 1 million of them. So for the Egyptians, all of a sudden, there's this whole huge minority of people that if they keep going, they're not going to be a minority much longer. And so the Egyptians begin to get worried, and they try killing the babies, and they try working them extra hard, and they basically keep them down, and they keep them so busy that they can't really have an uprising. And the Egyptians are worried that they might rebel against them. So now, think about the people from their perspective. Here we are, we're a family, and we've been living here in Egypt. And let me just say this about the slavery in Egypt. The slavery in Egypt was nothing like the slavery in America. So if you're used to thinking of slavery like the way we treated people that we brought over from Africa back in the early part of our country, this is a different thing. These people had it much better than the African slaves that were brought to America years ago. The Israel slaves could travel around, and they were worked very hard, and it was really unpleasant, but it wasn't all bad. In fact, God uses the period of slavery. He kind of set it up on purpose and sends them to Egypt, and it sort of serves as an incubator. They get all they want to eat. They have great childbirth is part of that story where all the babies are born and they grow up healthy, and so the population explodes, and all of that was the working of God. They didn't know it, of course. They just know that life is going along, and then all of a sudden it gets pretty bad. All right? Now, here are some things I want you to remember about the slavery. First, they're subjected to something, so they don't have the freedom that normal people have, of course. They have to be told what to do and everything. But it's not all bad being a slave. They get their food, their health care, they get, well, such as it was in those days, but they're basically cared for, house and stuff and everything. And so all they have to do, they only have one worry in the whole world. And that one worry is making sure that the boss is happy. If the boss ain't happy, then nobody's happy. So you just keep the boss happy, and then life is not pleasant, but it's not as horrible as it was, say, for slavery in the early part of the American situation. Okay. Another thing about these particular people, they were not only slaves, but they were kind of a nation without being a nation. They didn't really have any, they weren't any laws. They had this one invisible God that they heard about through stories, but there was no Bible, there was no literature, there was no religious law, no temple, no house of worship of any kind. They had never been a nation. They had never had a place that they called their home. So all this was is sort of a nomadic peoples that grew into this giant minority inside the borders of Egypt. And so they were kind of lost. And they were just a group of people without really an identity or a country or anything else. And so in these two respects, they're a little bit like some of us are. We talked about slavery. A lot of us, especially young people, you have your needs met. You get food and clothing and housing and all of that taken care of, but you don't have a lot of freedom. This idea of slaves is what I meant when we were talking about being stuck in a bad situation. Secondly, a lot of us are lost. Of course, we know the story of the prodigal son, and there's lost in the sense of you're not saved, but there's also lost in a sense that you don't really have a direction. You don't really have a focus for your life. There's not something that's a guiding principle for you. You're just kind of adrift. And so in those two senses, we are very much like those people were, and they're going to serve a good example. There are a couple of New Testament passages I'm going to have your teacher give to you if you want to look them up later, but The New Testament passages talk about us being slaves to sin and slaves to rules. Some people have rules for everything, and you're slavishly obedient to the rules. You have to follow the rules. And then other people are slaves to false teachers, for instance. They believe things that they've been told by their teachers or their parents or their religion or whatever, and it turns out they're not really true. And so there's a form of slavery there to false teachers. I want to highlight this passage about being lost in 1 Peter chapter 2 because this connects with us in our record. Listen to the words Peter wrote. This isn't talking about Israel, this is talking about us. You are a chosen people, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you weren't a people, but now you're God's people. I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Look, there's a sense in which all of us are lost and adrift, and God wants to rescue us from that and give us a purpose and a reason and a hope and take us to a better land, figuratively speaking, of course, and help us to honor God. Our second character is Moses. Now, we all have an image of Moses, probably from some movie we saw. This is my particular image of Moses. It's an actor, Charlton Heston, who played Moses in a movie called The Ten Commandments from when I was younger. We used to see this all the time, and this is the image of Moses. I suppose many of you have other images of Moses, maybe from the Prince of Egypt, or maybe this green fellow with the, I don't know if that's a pickle or a cucumber. I'm not a big VeggieTales guy myself. But what's your image of Moses? Is it a strong, powerful leader and a guy that's going to take everyone out of slavery, and everyone gets around him and says, all right, Moses, we'll follow you anywhere, and Pharaoh's this big bad guy? Well, if that's your image of Moses, you're mistaken. Here's a much better image of Moses, and this one is from a really old movie, back in the silent film era. But check this out. Now this is an image of Moses. See, from the people's perspective, when Moses comes onto the scene, he's an 80-year-old man. 80. He's not a young guy. And nobody's seen Moses in 40 years. So when he got kicked out of the country. Now again, we tend to know the story because we think of the baby and the bulrushes and all of that or something. Listen, from the people's perspective, almost everyone, except for maybe his family, and even they've forgotten him. I mean, he moved on and left town and got married and had kids and everything else. All Moses is to the people of Israel, he's an old guy, 80 years old, who comes to town and tells everybody, I'm going to lead you into freedom. I'm going to lead you out of Egypt. Well, how do you know, Moses? Well, this bush told me to. It's the invisible God, and we're gonna lead you out. Well, you know right there, everybody's going, yeah, right. Okay, Moses, you just go right ahead and knock yourself out. If that's something that you think you can do, well, we'd love to have you try to do that. So they just kind of let him go. He's a crazy old guy. Now, this is Moses. But here's the other thing, from Moses' perspective, that you should know. Moses did not want to do this. He knew they would think he was crazy. He knew Pharaoh would think he was crazy. He knew no one was going to pay attention to him. And he didn't know too much about this God that spoke to him from out of the burning bush. He did not want the job. Have you ever felt like that? You ever been asked to do something at church, or maybe you've been talked to about sharing your faith in school and you didn't want to do it? Then you have a friend in Moses, because he didn't want this job. He got it put on him. In the New Testament, it says Moses did what he did by faith. It had to do with believing, and faith and belief are the same word. We'll talk more about this in the series. But by faith, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. See, by faith, he left Egypt, he persevered, and he kept the Passover. What we're going to talk about in here is how faith can be the thing that gives you ability to do things